Let's begin with Midsommar, written and directed in 2019 by Ari Aster. Friends take a trip to a once-in-a-lifetime midsummer festival in a remote Swedish village. What begins as a carefree summer holiday in a land of eternal sunshine takes a sinister turn when the insular villagers invite their guests to partake in festivities that render the pastoral paradise increasingly unnerving and viscerally disturbing. This film was made on a $9 million budget and had a $47 million box office and is 83% on Rotten Tomatoes. It stars Florence Pugh, Jack Rayner, Wilhelm Blomgren, William Jackson Harper, and Will Poulter.
When this film came out, it was so shocking and visceral, and it was so different from what you usually see from horror movies, especially the way it's shot with the bright lighting. Most of it takes place in daylight. And I like how there's no supernatural, paranormal elements in this film. It's all about humans and humanity and the evils that they find within themselves. And I think Ari Aster knocked this out of the park with his sophomore effort.
Yeah, Ari Aster is clearly a horror auteur. I know a lot of people are critical of his style, thinking he's pretentious, and maybe his films are, like, especially Midsommar. I've seen a lot of reviews. People think it's very slow. It's overly zealous. People think it's just very boring, too. I think that's an amazing film. Obviously, it's going to be tough to follow up Hereditary, which was a borderline masterpiece. It's one of the best horror films made in the last 25, 30 years, for sure. But again, a great sophomore effort. I really had been... It was one of those movies, you see the trailers and you're like, I really want to see this movie, but also, like, I'm kind of terrified to see this movie.
Yeah.
I know I'm going to shit my pants, so I always had it, like, on the back burner of, like, I'll get to it eventually, and I finally saw it, and holy crap, it is disturbing as it is beautiful.
And I think one of the strengths to Ari Aster's writing and filmmaking is that he's able to elicit so much tension throughout the entire course of his films. Same thing with Hereditary, same thing with Midsommar, where he's just slowly building the tension from the beginning to the end until it finally culminates in this crescendo of absolute madness. And he did it both times in his films, and he does it perfectly. And it's hard to pull off, I think, but he's great with it.
Yeah, he also has this style of, like, very dark humor at times. This movie's sometimes hysterical. Mm-hmm. And same thing with Hereditary. There's very funny beats as well. But he blends this intense visual horror and often disturbing images with dark, hilarious comedy, which kind of balances off the mood of the film so that you can withstand everything that's going on as an audience member.
Yeah, and like we talked about Jaws a couple episodes ago and how Spielberg, the whole film is basically during the daytime. Midsommar is pretty much mostly 95% of the time is set during the day because of the long days in Sweden at that time. And there's something just a little more terrifying and frightening about horrific things happening in daylight. You know what I mean? There's no dark shadows. There's no things to hide. Like, there's no corners where you can't see what's in there. You can see everything in the frame. And I think that having horror elements within that kind of context makes it even more terrifying.
Yeah, it speaks volumes to his craft and skill as a director to be able to terrify the shit out of you in broad daylight. Same thing with Spielberg and Jaws, like you just said. We can see everything. There's no one hiding behind shadows. There are a few scenes at night which are terrifying as well, but for the most part, the climax, the long climax, all the terror and horror and everything going on is perfectly lit and bright. And the ironic thing is you never get a shot of the sun, which is ironic because the whole film, spoiler alerts, is about sacrificial rituals to feed the sun god.
What do you think that this movie's about? What would you say? What do you think he's trying to say with this movie?
I think this film, at times, you can look at it as the most intense breakup movie of all time. So it kind of is, if you've ever been hurt in a breakup and you've had your heart broken, this is, like, kind of a good movie to watch because you get this feeling of, like, vengeance at the end of it. Mm. Also, a sense of identity, but also I think mental illness is an obvious theme in this film because in the film Danny's sister, it opens up with her sister commits a horrible act of murder-suicide on herself and her parents, Danny's parents. And clearly she had bipolar disorder, which they talk about. And then Danny also has mental illness too, which she keeps at bay with medication throughout the film. So I think it's about her trying to deal with that mental illness, but also succumbing to it because we deal with an unfaithful boyfriend, bad friends who just don't support her. They don't try to help her out. He stays in this relationship just to so she doesn't lose herself because of the trauma that she's dealt with. And so while she's dealing with this trauma, she eventually comes to the mental illness, which consumes her by the end of the film.
I agree. I think that a way to look at it is this movie is a breakup movie. And like you said, because of Danny's family's deaths, Christian, her boyfriend, Christian is an awful boyfriend. And before her family dies, he's even talking with his friends, and they're trying to talk him into breaking up with her. And he obviously has doubts about the relationship. But then, like you said, he stays with Danny because of the death of her family, as a way to keep her from like falling into a horrible depression. And so from that point on, he's reluctantly stuck in the relationship. He thinks that's the way he views the relationship. He's reluctantly there, and he's kind of stuck there. And so there's this really awkward tension between Danny and Christian where they're a couple, but they don't seem to have much love for each other anymore, and they obviously shouldn't be together. But Danny needs him. Danny needs someone to have in her life that she can hold on to because she lost everything. But Christian, yeah, he's there, but he's not there emotionally. He's an absent boyfriend, and I think that throughout the course of the film, they both realize this, and that leads to the culmination of the finale of the film.
Yeah, and I think Christian is one of the villains in the movie. He's generally a bad person. He's not a good friend. He's not a good boyfriend. He obviously has indifference to the relationship. He forgets his girlfriend's birthday. He hides things from her. He sleeps with another woman. Halfway through the film, he steals his friend Josh's dissertation and thesis that's going to be on this Hagar village, but tries to play it off like it was also his idea and that they can share the idea. So he seems just...
And before any of this, he didn't even invite her or tell her about the trip they were planning.
Exactly. So he's just not a good guy, in my opinion. And a lot of this in a lot of the film is actually laid out for us in the very first shot of this film. There's this beautiful and intriguing and haunting mural, which is the opening of the film. And it's basically a painting that basically reveals the entire plot of the story. And we have the murder-suicide of Danny's sister with their parents, with the tubes connecting them, a figure of a skeleton representing the Grim Reaper. We can see an image of the Swedish friend Pell in the trees watching the dysfunctional couple, but obviously the dishonest boyfriend, which is with his hands tied behind his back. The introduction of the strangers to the village, including the academic and the jester. This group now travels and meets the Haggars, and Danny becomes the May Queen. The bear and the goat are there. The older members who jump from the cliff with the wings upside down are there, which kind of shows that they're flying. They're not flying upwards; they're descending down. The feast, the dancing rituals, the sun, the empty throne. The painting also represents winter, spring, summer, autumn, all the seasons of the year. And in autumn, instead of harvesting crop, this village harvests sacrifices to their sun god, which happens every 90 years. It's a beautiful mural.
It's a really great Easter egg that Ari Aster put in, where he's revealing the story, and it kind of has like a Wes Anderson-esque quality to it. You know what I mean? And then there's also another mural depicted, which shows the love potion that Maja ends up making for Christian, and it shows the stages of the entire process of making the love potion. And Ari Aster brilliantly lays out clues like these two to the actual film. And then there's actually, in terms of the film, there's a bunch of little tiny clues and hints that show you what's going to happen besides those. In the opening, Danny's apartment, above her bed, there's a painting of a bear with a young queen, which ends up being related to Danny becoming the May Queen at the end of the film, and then Christian being put into the empty bear body at the film. And then there's a picture of Danny, a framed picture of Danny in her parents' bedroom, and then all surrounding the frame are a bunch of flowers that they've placed behind it. So it is a hint and a foreshadow to her becoming the May Queen with all the flowers. There's also a photo of the scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz inside the guy's apartment in the opening of the film. It's right on top of the fridge, and that relates to their bodies being stuffed with hay and at the end of the film. And there's also another scarecrow reference. There's a scarecrow stuffed animal on one of the shelves in their apartments. And then these little clues hint at the impending danger and fate of these characters as a way to think that they didn't ever have control of the circumstances. Like, these were always their past that were laid out for them.
Yeah, and more of these murals are present in the interior walls of the large sleeping quarters that all the villagers and the Americans visit. So all those walls or murals are actually foreshadowed images of what's going to happen throughout their experience there at the Hagar. And also, just to go back to the original mural at the beginning of the film, it's It's very reminiscent of a painting called The Garden of Early Delights, which is a modern title given to a triptych oil painting on oak panel painted by the early Netherlandish master Hieronymus Bosch between 1490 and 1510, which is a very beautiful mural.
Yeah, his artwork, all of his artwork depicts these giant settings with so many little stories happening within each painting between all these strange characters. And he was actually probably he was so ahead of his time. The creatures and images that he made in his artwork are things that like you would think a science fiction animator would create nowadays. And so this guy was just on another level creatively than anyone else back then. And in terms of, there's another really specific image that's laid out for the audience when Christian's put in that small house when he's going to interview with that elder about Majda wanting to have sex with him. He looks at an image of a burning bear on the wall right in front of him.
Yeah, so a lot of people, again, are critical of this film, specifically these kind of like forced foreshadows, which people might say. But to me, I love this kind of stuff. I love seeing a director kind of hint at things that are to come. You can hate it or love it. It's your opinion or not, but I really enjoy it. And it brings like this mysterious element to the first time you're watching the movie. Like, what do all these things mean? Because it makes you pay attention to the film more. I think it brings you more in from an analytical perspective to try to pay attention better and see connections that aren't complete yet.
And I just adore seeing the attention to detail that the filmmakers craft into movies like this, where they took so much care into crafting the sets and the story itself. It's so great to see that in films. You know what I mean?
Yeah, this film was very, very meticulously made, although it was kind of a quick production in a rush greenlight. The film was greenlit in May 2018, like right after Hereditary came out, right after the success of it, and it eventually premiered in June 2019, making it an unusually short production for such a widely released film.
From greenlight to release, that's very rare to be that fast, yeah.
And then you add in how well it was shot and the cinematography and how clearly well planned it was by Ari Aster and his team. It's kind of astonishing how quickly they made it.
And then in terms of the film, obviously this is one of the most shocking films that I've seen in recent memory, where you think walking in it's going to be some kind of cult movie, but it's not really a cult movie. It's more of a film based upon ancient traditions passed throughout generations. And then what's so shocking are the outcomes of these characters and the way Ari Aster slowly rolls it out and kind of hides a lot of the horror that happens. For example, several characters are killed off screen. We never see them killed.
But we see what happens
what happens to their bodies when they're eventually stuffed with hay. And so by not showing the actions of this community towards these people and instead seeing the outcomes is, I think, what makes it so shocking, because you're like, this character disappeared. What happened to them? And you think something bad happened to them. For example, when Mark disappears, something bad happened to him because he's the one who peed on the tree, and Ulf was extremely angry with him for it. And then he disappears for about 20 minutes, and then when Christian goes into that small shed and he finds Mark's body has been flayed from the inside and his lungs have been exposed and he's been put through some kind of ritualistic punishment. And so I think it's terrifying, rather than showing the community doing that to him, seeing instead the result of it, I think is more terrifying.
And even before that, when Josh sneaks into the religious temple to get sneak photos of the texts and the sacred documents that he wants to gather evidence for his thesis, and then he's in there by himself in the dark, and then he sees who he thinks is Mark walks in, but really it's Ulf wearing Mark's freaking face.
Terrifying.
It's horror. It's scary as hell. It's terrifying to see what that looks like. It's kind of like Silence of the Lambs with Lecter wearing the other guy's face. It's just disturbing as hell, and that leads to his death. But this whole idea of sacrifices and these older cultures and their rituals, it's obviously a fascination that we have today. And I think a lot of people look at, because of how educated we are today and how advanced we are technologically and philosophically and scientifically, a lot of people look back on those cultures as highly unintelligent, when really those things were done in a practical sense. They were done to, in their belief, ensure the survival of their civilizations and their communities, because these people were so dependent on the land. They were dependent on nature and harvest and tame weather for their survival, that they truly believe that there was a connection with rituals. Maybe not necessarily, I'm not saying human sacrifices are good, but not everyone did human sacrifice. This is a very Hollywoodized version of it, but these rituals did provide significant meaning to what these people believed in. And I don't think it was a sign of unintelligence. It's, again, a sign of dependence on what they believed was causing their success in life.
Yeah. For example, they didn't have science back then in these ancient cultures. And so the science to these cultures was religious beliefs and spiritual beliefs. And so they believed in those ideas as concrete as we believe in the fact that there are cells and atoms. So they use these rituals and spiritual ideas and religions to explain the world around them and to interpret the world around them. So obviously, it makes sense that they would use these ideas and rituals as a way to modify the world and benefit themselves and try to bring prosperous growths to their farm crops and good luck upon their people. So they're obviously very animalistic practices looking from this kind of perspective where we are now. But back then, that was like science to them.
Like you said earlier, this film doesn't depend on supernatural abilities or supernatural beings, spirits, monsters or anything like that. This really, the monsters are the humans themselves. But this film, psychedelics play a huge role in this movie, and we see this pretty early on when they first get to Sweden, and Pell gives them the mushroom tea, which they basically sip throughout the entire movie, which they're given a lot because this culture in Ariaster, the psychedelic tea acts as like a lubricant for the entrance of these people into this haggard community. It releases control of them, of their lives, which eventually one of them gets control back at the end of the film. So instead of supernatural beings, we have these drug trip outs, which provide almost a dreamlike experience for the characters and the audience.
Yeah, and it's a great element. He depicts the state of being high really well in this film in a unique way. And also, it brings to the idea that perhaps that these psychedelics and these trips that the hacker community experience, they explain that as a realistic spiritual phenomenon for them. But Ari Aster also hints at the idea that all of this is actually a sham and they're all mistaken and none of it actually works. So when all the bodies have been prepared for the sacrifice in that pyramid building, and then two of the men who volunteered for the sacrifice, Ulf and Ingmar, they are given this dew that's supposed to numb them.
It's like bee pollen.
Yeah,
I think.
It's some kind of tree yew, and they're given this by the elders, and they're told that they're not going to experience any pain because this is going to protect them and it's going to numb their bodies. And then they're sitting in the ritualistic structure, and the elders set it on fire. And as the fires begin burning and surround them, the fires get closer to them, and then you can see that they're actually experiencing the pain of the heat. And then they both start screaming out in agony because they can feel themselves being burned alive. So in that way, the yew actually didn't work. So maybe none of this is actually working. Maybe none of this is actually a real thing. It's just a crazy ritual that's been passed on over time that actually doesn't do anything.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And so the main character of this film is Danny, played by Florence Pugh, and she's phenomenal in this movie.
She blew up that year.
And she's, again, dealing with the immense trauma of the murder-suicide that took place in her family. She's using this trip as sort of a way to kind of deal with her grief, hopefully. And, again, you can interpret this film as overcoming that grief, and then it's a breakup film at the same time. This movie doesn't really get too disturbing until after the first act, really. I mean, we know something weird's going on. Like, this village seems a little odd. It's very rustic. It's obviously there's no technology or anything, and these people seem like they've been living there for generations, which they have. And it's not until we see the first disturbing image of the first human sacrifice where they show up at that cliff, and these two elders who were at the dinner the day before, they jump off a cliff willingly and sacrifice themselves because according to their culture in that village, they've reached the end of their life cycle, which is 72 years. So they're ending their lives to bring prosperity to the new generation. So the way these people live is they're living for the long-term health of their tribe and their village, and they're living for other generations. And this is one of the most shocking things I've ever seen in a movie, especially the last 10 years when I saw this, and I completely fucking shit my pants when they both fell off, and then the the woman dies instantly, but the guy, obviously, he had one job, hit the rock, and he misses it. And he just shatters his leg. And then we have the guy with the hammer ready to go there. And you can only imagine how many people that hammer has killed. And it's normal to them, but obviously the Americans are freaking out, except for Josh, because Josh knew this was coming. So Josh has this weird perspective where he knows things about this village and knows what the Hagar and
not exactly this village, but the culture in Sweden, the ancient cultures.
Yeah, so he understands this culture to an extent. So he was more curious than anything.
Like I said, one of the reasons why the elders killed themselves is for the advancement of the village and the community to keep it healthy, but also it's a way of preventing elders to fall into old age and deal with things like Alzheimer's and severe illness, and it prevents them from having to deal with the pain of growing into old age. And the reason why it's the age of 72 that they killed themselves is because this culture sees aging in 4 stages, which relate to the 4 seasons of the world. And that's all related to 9. So it's increments of 18 years. And so the first stage is spring, when you're from the ages 0 to 18. And the second age is summer, which is 19 to 36. And then you have autumn, which is 37 to 54. And then the final stage is winter, which is ages 55 to 72. And so these 4 stages of life in this village's eyes correlate to the 4 seasons on Earth.
And so, yeah, Josh has this odd perspective of the culture, whereas Mark has no respect for this culture, which is obviously seen when he pees on the tree, which is where they place the ashes of all the elders who die and anyone who dies in the tribe, in the village. So after those 2 elders jump off the cliff, their bodies are burned and their ashes are spread. And Mark pees on that tree, which is, you can only imagine the generations and the amount of people whose ashes have been spread on that tree, which obviously leads to his death. And what you find out throughout this film is that all these sacrifices, these people they're killing and sacrificing, we learn, except for like that British couple, which we don't really know too much backstory on, they all kind of deserved, to an extent, in the eyes of the village, to be sacrificed. They all had it coming for what they were doing. So Josh was trying to take advantage of the tribe and the village for his academic gain. Mark peed on the tribal tree, the ancestral tree. Christian also tried to take advantage of the village, and
Christian was also selected as part of the ritual process for having sex with Maja, the virgin. So he was already placed into the ritual by the community already.
Yeah, so the community, to preserve their bloodline and to increase the chances that they have more healthy babies, they have outsiders come in to mate with to impregnate the young woman.
Yeah, and there's actually this really cool hint at this idea when the entire village is having lunch together and everyone has this glass of what looks like some kind of it looks like orange juice or something, and then Christian's glass has a bit of a reddish hint to it, and that's because Maja has already begun the ritual process and she slipped a little menstrual blood inside of his juice, and so that's why it has a reddish hue compared to the orange hues of everyone else.
Also, his meat pie has a pubic hair in it.
Yeah. So and this is all laid out in that banner that we see in the beginning of the film, laying out the ritual process of creating this love potion.
And Ari Aster deliberately doesn't provide many subtitles for the Swedish language in this film because he wants to alienate the audience as much as he's alienating the characters from each other. And it puts us in the shoes of the Americans and the British couple when we don't really know what's going on. We don't know what the Swedish people are saying. All we get for translation is the false things that Pell is saying to them, or the things that Pell is hiding from them.
Yeah. And this all leads to these crazy things are happening, and we know that people are dying, and then Danny ends up being a part of that ritualistic dance, which is a dancing contest to see who can last the longest standing up, and she ends up winning and becoming the May Queen. She has lost her family. She has no one left in the world. Her family's gone. And when she comes to this community, by becoming the May Queen, they accept her and they welcome her into their community as one of the Hagar. And so she finally has found, by the end of the film, a new place, a new family to live with, which replaces the death of her family.
And during the ritualistic feast, Christian is taken away by other members of the village and Maja to perform the sexual act to help and try and impregnate Maja. And this is a really disturbing scene, and at times pretty hysterical, because he's in this room full of other naked women,
Yeah.
and they're all watching him, and they're all moaning with Maja and the girl, and one of them even starts helping Christian thrust into her. It's just really odd, and it's kind of disturbing and hysterical at the same time. But also, this is where Danny peeks through the hole and sees Christian having sex with Maja, and this is the final instance that finally Danny pretty much succumbs, in my opinion, to her mental illness, succumbs to a mental breakdown.
And that leads to this really great scene where, after seeing Christian have sex with Maja, Danny goes back to the house where everyone sleeps in. Danny starts weeping and sobbing and crying, and then all of the women replicate the kind of grief that she's experiencing. They all sob and they all cry with her. And this is really interesting because this kind of thing happens 3 times in the film. It happens at this point when Danny's crying and sobbing. It happens when the man, fails to kill himself when he jumps off the cliff. When he's screaming in pain, all of the other members of the community also scream in pain. And then in the scene when Christian's having sex with Maja and the women are also moaning in pleasure as well as Maja. So this community, everyone is connected together. Everyone is connected emotionally and spiritually. And so for the first time, Danny, since the death of her family, she's been with this guy who lacks any kind of empathy for her, isn't connected with her. And so this community has finally given her a people to connect with on a deep spiritual and emotional level. So this entire community, like I said earlier, becomes her new family.
And after that sex scene, actually, Christian was supposed to run out of that building with a robe on and everything, but Jack Rayner himself suggested to Ari Aster that he do it completely nude, because he was inspired by other horror films like Last House on the Left, the original one, where so many of these horror films depict like women in very vulnerable positions, like running out of a building, like half naked or naked, covered in blood. And he wanted to flip that on its head and have a male character run screaming out of a building, basically half naked or naked and very vulnerable instead of a woman, to kind of flip it on its head.
I love that. It's really funny because it's something horrible, is going to happen to him, but it's kind of funny because he's running around naked.
And so this is a very long climax that's going on. We're trying to finally understand everything that's going on. And then Danny's the Maid Queen. She has to decide the final act of the ritual, who will be the final sacrifice of the ritual to be put into the bear suit. So the bear basically symbolizes a protection against predators of the village. She's in charge of deciding who will go inside the bear suit and who will die. And this ritual, the final ritual of the sacrifices, only happens in this village every 90 years. So this isn't an annual thing that they do. All the other stuff that happens in the film, that's annual practice for the Midsommar of this particular village. This isn't every Swedish village. It's not, Midsommar is not really like this, people. So this is specifically the last ritual with the giant triangle building that happens every 90 years. So it's a very special celebration of Midsommar for this village. And when Christian's running around naked, he runs into the shed and he sees the dismembered and disemboweled body hanging from strings and wires, and it's disgusting. And the craziest thing is he's still alive.
His lungs are breathing.
He's still alive. They knock him out with their natural sedatives and everything, and he becomes paralyzed. He's in this wheelchair, and Danny has to decide and chooses him to be the sacrifice, the final sacrifice for the ritual.
My mind was blown when I saw them like setting up the ritual, and they're carrying the body stuff with straw, and they're setting up every ritualistic piece and person that's a part of the ritual. When Christian finally ends up inside of the bear, you're just like, holy fuck, this is so wild.
Especially because the whole first act and the whole second act, you're wondering, what is this big yellow pyramid building for? What is this structure for? Because it's so unique compared to the rest of the buildings and the structures that the villagers have. And I love this final shot of Danny basically watching Christian be taken away into that triangle and being burned alive, because Danny in Florence Pugh's performance is so phenomenal. And just this single shot, all you have to do is compare Danny's mood and face throughout the first 98% of this film with the final shot, and you can see she goes from so many emotions, from like pain and envy and revenge and empathy and loving and longing and anger, to just this eerie smile that looks exactly like the smile that the sun has in the mural in the beginning of the film. And she's in that big floral dress, which means that she's finally entered into this community and she's now a part of it.
I think Danny will be like Pell, because Pell tells her earlier that his parents died and this community took him in, so I think she'll have a similar life as him. And then the ending shot when she smiles, it can be interpreted two ways, where one way you could see it that she's like had a full mental breakdown and she's just lost it. But then the other way you can look at it is that she's pretty much breaking up with Christian at the end of the movie, and she's taking power and control back in her life.
Yeah, that's a bit excessive for being totally coherent in a breakup. Either I interpret it as mental breakdown, or she's so like high on psychedelics from the entire week she doesn't really know what's going on. So I think it's either one of those. I think it's she's finally had a mental breakdown.
Yeah. It's more fun to think of it like, I break up with you. Burn in hell.
We've all felt like that at some point, wanting to do that. The film was originally given an NC-17 by the MPAA. According to Ari Aster, he had to cut about 30 minutes of footage to get the R rating, which he actually put back in and added about 24 minutes of extra footage to the director's cut, which is on VOD. So if you want to watch an even longer version, that's about 3 hours. He adds a lot of stuff, and it's pretty intense.
I want to watch that. I haven't seen that. That sounds really cool.
And William Jackson Harper is the only American actor in the film. Jack Rayner, he's Irish. Florence Pugh is English. Will Poulter is English. And all other supporting actors are either Swedish, British, or Hungarian.
Americans aren't cutting it anymore, man.
Well, Americans just... Yeah, you're right. And you can even compare, and I think Ari Aster did too, the sacrificial burning of the temple is kind of like the burning of a box of possessions of an ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend. So it's kind of like a cathartic way to let somebody go. Just like, so Danny is probably letting go of Christian from her life. Finally, for the last 4 years, I'm sure he was a horrible person and boyfriend to her.
Yeah, he seems like a shitty boyfriend.
Again, a bit excessive to light him on fire, though.
I mean, yeah.
But again, and that sacrificial burning at the end is very reminiscent of The Wicker Man.
The whole movie's reminiscent of The Wicker Man, which is, I think, like the greatest film made about any kind of like paganistic cult society. It's unbelievable. The original one, not the one with Nicolas Cage that was made in the early 2000s, but the original one, unbelievable horror movie. Check it out if you haven't seen it.